the time. So I'm going to kick this off and just speak to the sort of framing chapter, sort of the anti-racism of Marxism, past and present, and talk to kind of what is at stake in this intervention and what's it offering. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book called The Soul of Black Thought. And he basically, if you like, made a case and a point about the color line as a defining fault line running through the world. But what we do in the book, in the framing chapter, is extend that notion, that this is a long color line. This is not just, if you like, a problematic of the 20th century, it's a problematic also of the 21st century. But of course, it's also a line that is contingent on various developments. It is a broken line at some moments because there are some breakthroughs against racism in the span of history and change. But there's also, if you like, a resurgence. And today we are seeing a new right, a neo-fascist white nationalism. We are seeing xenophobia. We are seeing narrow black nationalisms, the apartheid-like oppression of Palestine, and further dispossessions of indigenous peoples, and Islamophobia as well. So there are particular conjunctural expressions of racism today. So there's an overinflation of racialized thinking and practices. And so we attempt to, through this intervention, spotlight these forms and expressions of racism. The other point to make is that in this context of an unraveling national liberation politics in South Africa, sort of official non-racialism has been assailed, it's been attacked, and in many instances has been coming apart. And that has also created space for other articulations around race, identity, and so on. And particularly a resurgent black consciousness, a nativist Africanism, you see white nationalism coming out of the shadows, and you're seeing xenophobic practices and so on. So race-based polarization is back, okay? And we're trying to, again, kind of work out what is informing this, what explains this, and so on. One of the ideologies that has been targeted in this moment of unraveling of national liberation politics is Marxism. And Marxism has been reduced in some quarters to a foreign ideology. It's been given a particular kind of genealogy. It's from European thinkers, it's from the West, etc. There's also been, if you like, attempts to relocate how we think about racism and anti-racism through identity politics, for example, notions of difference, etc. That's not to say that's unimportant, but some versions of identity politics also have their limits. They don't have a material grounding, for example. Some of it is very individual-centered, etc., etc. So, I mean, I think the caricature of Marxism is something that we speak to directly in this volume. That actually, if you look at the history of Marxist thought in this country and how it's traveled, how it's been indigenized, how it's been translated, actually there's a rich body of work that is very much committed to anti-racism and anti-apartheid. So whether it was frameworks and theories of racial capitalism, whether it was theories of colonialism of a special type, articulations of modes of production, studies of ideology, social history, national question debates, and studies about the making of apartheid and the apartheid state, Marxist thought has contributed to trying to explain and to understand racism in South Africa, and has also, if you like, been implicated in national liberation resistance and struggle. But a lot of that gets eviscerated. A lot of that, if you like, gets pushed aside in the kind of crude caricature. That this is white thought, this is thought that's incapable of grappling with racism. The other point to make is that we attempt to also understand what is the relationship between racism and Marx's thought. So we take the charge seriously. So if you say that Marxism is racist, and its source comes from a white male thinking in the 19th century, located in the European world. Well, let's interrogate what was Marx thinking and how did Marx grapple with racism. Now, this is not a sort of definitive response, but it's an attempt to grapple with this issue. The second issue that we grapple with is how has Marxism positioned itself in anti-racist struggles in the 20th century? What is the record, if you like? How efficacious was Marxism in confronting racism in the 20th century? How far did it push back the color line, if you like? How far did it disrupt it? How far did it break and go beyond it? And so on. I think the third issue is to think about, well, going beyond the binary that's at work sometimes in contemporary discourse of white Marxism and black Marxism, and kind of putting it into these very crude boxes. But to really map where is Marxism today in current anti-racist struggles in the world. Okay, how are Marxist perspectives implicated in these struggles, and to situate that. And then, of course, to also think about the offering of the book. So I'm just going to speak to some of these themes very quickly. So yes, there is a Eurocentric moment in Marx. Okay. But Edward Said, for example, in Orientalism, he categorizes and places Marx in what is called a Eurocentric camp. He's a Eurocentric thinker. Essentially, he's a white racist, a white supremacist. That's the kind of interpretation that you end up with from Orientalism. And this has formed the basis for a body of work on post-colonial thinking, etc. And so Marx is a pariah. Okay, he's disavowed, and Marxism is disavowed in post-colonial thinking. But actually, if you really look more closely at the Marx's corpus of work, it is.
I'm just wondering if we're at the right place. Is this the racism after apartheid?
Yes, yes. Please come in.
Can we join?
Yes.
Sure.
So Marx was not, if you like, in the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, developing or articulating a developed perspective on the relationship between racism and capitalism. Marx, like most intellectuals, like all of us, was in the process, was in a journey of trying to understand the capitalist world of his time. And so there are lots of, if you like, inconsistencies, there are lots of breaks in his body of work and his corpus. Now, there are actually three epistemological ruptures in Marx's, or from Marx's epistemological Eurocentrism, as his thought developed and so on. The first epistemological rupture has got to do with this idea of linear historical change. And this is a residue from Hegel and the idea that the West embodies the culmination of history and so on. And there's a bit of that in Marx, actually, but Marx overturns that over time. He breaks with this linearity, and he breaks with even this kind of technological determinism that has to happen for societies to bring about change and transition. And so that's even there in his work, in his referencing of debates with Russian Marxists, etc. There's some interesting evidence there. There's also, if you like, an attempt to go beyond his characterization of the Asiatic mode of production. And this has also been derided and considered Orientalist thinking. But actually Marx, because he was working with ethnographic resources of his time, he was working with resources, intellectual insights of his time from this pseudo-scientific racist milieu. But as he grapples with research and evidence, he realizes that there is something distinctive and different, that the Asiatic trajectory of history didn't necessarily have to correlate and collapse into the European trajectory of history. There were two different histories here, and there were two different sets of social structures, etc. here. So he was very, very clear eventually in recognizing these distinctions. The other important epistemological rupture in Marx, which is very important, is his recognition of universals. His recognition that capitalism and capital will constantly try to expand, reproduce the requirements for accumulation, and try to, if you like, prevail over the world. At the same time, there was resistance to this, that the working class was also pushing back and trying to find, if you like, moments to break through, to ensure well-being, to meet their needs, etc. So from the context of these universals and from his lived experience, Marx also, in the 1860s, was one of the co-founders. Actually, in 1848, he was invited by the League of the Just to help draft the Communist Manifesto. But by the 1860s, he was a co-founder of the first International of Workers in the world and very active in it. And in that context, also began to recognize the deleterious impacts of colonialism. All right? And Marx basically recognizes that colonialism and colonial modernity is actually not necessarily a progressive thing that's going to emancipate people and so on. And he makes very important observations, particularly in his journalistic writings, on slavery, for example. And his interventions on slavery are explicitly anti-racist. They are explicitly more radical than some of the abolitionists, including Lincoln, where Marx in the 19th century is calling for full rights for people that have been enslaved and so on. Okay? So here's Marx, the anti-racist, taking a stand in history, even in the context of the International at that time, saying that workers, black and white, have to unite, have to fight against colonial racism. But he's also saying something else in the context of ethno-nationalism and colonialism and capitalism vis-a-vis the Irish struggle. And there he also evokes, if you like, an attempt to build universal solidarity amongst workers. And he's very explicit that, yes, these struggles are important, you need this national liberation struggle for the aspirations of the Irish people, etc. But at the same time, the workers have to find their place in all of this. So there's evidence in Marx. So on the one hand, you have the Marx of the Communist Manifesto, who is epistemologically Eurocentric. And there's this radiating model, okay, at work in his consciousness. Modernity from the centers is going to spread beyond that, and you're going to reproduce, if you like, this Eurocentric world. But by the time of the Marx of Capital Volume 1, you have Marx saying, well, you know, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, the enslavement, entombment in minds of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. So what Marx is doing in Capital, at least over a decade and a half later, is recognizing that in the originary moments of capitalism, racism was present, okay? And that racism was part of the making of capitalism. So you see, in this context, if you like, an illustration that, yes, Marx wasn't born an anti-racist, and Marx wasn't writing from the start as an anti-racist, but as a social thinker of his time, and a radical one at that, critical of bourgeois thought in the West, and not just a Eurocentric critique of that body of thought, but also as an anti-racist, finds his voice and finds his place in the 19th century. The other points that I want to make relate to Marxism against racism in the 20th century. Now, there have been three major problems with Marxism and racism. The first has been the embrace of the Eurocentric Marx in some Marxisms, which make them blind to racism, okay? And that is a very, very serious problem that has marked Marxism in the 20th century. So in other words, for many of these Marxisms, the kind of reproducing of modernity and a capitalist modernity without questioning its racist underpinnings, its history, its assumptions, and so on was the way to go. And you see this even in the industrializing of the Soviet Union and Stalin. You're seeing this in the Chinese growth-centered and obsessed accumulation path, etc. And they adopt in the end the worst expressions of Eurocentrism in modernity: wage exploitation, alienation, techno-centered violence, exclusive ethno-nationalisms, and the ecocidal domination of nature. So a Eurocentric Marxism on the march in our world actually reproduces a Eurocentric world. And that's been a problem. The second problem in Marxism actually has been a formulaic understanding of race and racism. And this has got to do with the impact of the victorious Marxism of Marxism-Leninism coming out of the Russian Revolution. And everybody in a very tortured way within this Marxist-Leninist slipstream of history trying to fit national context into Lenin's formula of the right to national self-determination and framing national question approaches imported from that canon. And that leads to some very strange things. So for example, in South Africa, how this gets translated in the 1920s and 30s and so on, is that Marxists actually were talking about balkanization on ethnic lines, right to self-determination, Xhosa people should have their rights, Zulu people, etc., etc. Some of that was there. In the context of Bolivia, for example, well, the indigenous were just invisible to the Communist Party in Bolivia, for example, okay? And so on and so on. So, the Moscow, if you like, the Soviet imprint on local conditions, etc., complexified the reception of Marxism and its indigenizing. The third problem with Marxism and racism, anti-racism, has been class reductionism. And this is a Marxism that has really foregrounded the primacy of the class contradiction. And it occludes any understanding of racism in the social world. And sometimes even patriarchy and gender oppression as well. It's all about collapsing everything into the great moment of the class struggle and the revolutionary breakthrough, and then all these other contradictions will get resolved. Okay? So in other words, an anti-racist plank of the struggle, an anti-patriarchal plank of the struggle was an aberration for these kind of pure class-centered, class-based approaches and so on. And these Marxisms are highly problematic. So in a sense, this book, this volume, pushes back against the Eurocentric Marxism, it pushes back against the kind of dogmatic, formulaic Marxism, and it pushes back against the narrow class reductionist Marxism that's blind to other forms of oppression. But in the 20th century, Marxism found its way within social democratic projects in the global north. It formed an ideological basis of that. It formed the basis of Marxist-Leninist parties and the Second World. It formed the basis, in many instances, of revolutionary nationalist movements. But, and here, I try to give a very brief mapping. So, were social democratic parties consistently anti-racist? Were Marxist-Leninist parties consistently anti-racist? Were revolutionary nationalist movements consistently anti-racist? Well, the record is much more checkered, and it's much more complex, coming out of the 20th century. In some places, like in the South in the United States in the 20s and 30s, the Communist Party was explicitly anti-racist. It was really organizing amongst the black working class in the United States, and it has a proud history of that. On the other hand, in the context of the post-colonial moment in Africa, the Marxist-Leninist vanguards in Mozambique and in Angola adopt if you like, after defeats, of course, a neoliberalized approach to their societies, reproducing a Euro-American ideological script for their societies. Okay. If you look at social democratic parties, so the Swedish Social Democratic Party was very committed to the anti-apartheid resistance in South Africa, but on the other hand, the Labour Party in the UK was also implicated in colonialism, in what happens in India and places like that. Okay, so there's a very complicated history around these movements, and so I think what we're trying to demonstrate is that some of the limits and some of the weaknesses of Marxism in the 20th century also impacted on their efficacy in terms of fighting racism. Just got a few more minutes. The other point I want to make is about beyond white Marxism and black Marxism, sort of Marxist theorizing of anti-racism and resistance today. So some of these weaknesses of Marxist theorizing and even political practice have lent themselves to this bifurcation in how Marxism is characterized as black Marxism and white Marxism. Because you have had Marxists, like C.L.R. James, for example, who foregrounded something like this, who foregrounded racial oppression and so on. But in the way that C.L.R. James gets located, for example, in post-colonial studies, he's a black Marxist. Okay, so he's not a Marxist. The other problem we have is a book written called Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. Now, this book is a very important book, but it's a book that also feeds into this bifurcation of a Marxism for white people and a Marxism for black people. And for various reasons, as I've been saying. It's about how he situates people like Du Bois and C.L.R. James. It's about how he understands the racialized ideology of European capitalism. It's very idealistic. There's also, if you like, a lack of a complex understanding of the history of racism and its contingencies and its specific historical relations, ideological structures and practices and so on over a 500-year period. And Marxists have looked at that 500-year period and so on in a much more rigorous way, I would argue. But in the end, I mean, Robinson's intervention leaves us, or takes us to a place where his work feeds into an anti-Marxism. Okay? So you have black Marxism, white Marxism, but in the end, it's not about Marxism, it's about a black radical tradition that displaces Marxism in its totality. That's not to say a black radical tradition is unimportant, but I think that there's a need also to be cautious about recognizing that Marxists have been contributing to that and more. Okay, so today Marxism and anti-racism is really interesting because there is an outpouring, and there's been a consistent one, of Marxist thinking against racial oppression and historical racisms. So the first body of work that we reference in here is Analyzing Race and Racism. And there's a rich body of work within Marxism that is doing that. There's a set of common ground around how historicizing racism has been happening in this world, locating it within the structural dynamics of capitalism, in relation to slavery and colonialism, etc. But then when it comes to conjunctural racisms, etc., Marxists slightly diverge and so on and so on. And there are different emphases, if you like, in some of the Marxist work that has been coming through. So for example, the work of Miles and Brown, they talk about ideological signification and processes of racialization linked to class relations and immigration. And so they give a lot of weight, if you like, to racism and racialization and its exclusionary effects. On the other hand, you have the work of somebody called Canfield. And Canfield really stakes out methodologically a racism as a distinct relation of oppression. Okay? And which means that it has to be understood in terms of its systemic and structural location and so on, and how it features in social reproduction, etc. So that's a very interesting approach to taking racism seriously. The other body of work is about race, oppression, and intersectionality. And here there are different Marxist approaches to these issues, and particularly Marxist feminists. And one body of Marxist feminist work rejects intersectionality as a very shallow concept. It doesn't have a material grounding, meaning it doesn't take capitalism seriously, and so cannot explain, if you like, these distinct identities and so on. It's also very individuated as an approach, so it starts with individual identities and tries to aggregate them and so on and so on, particularly as a strategic politics, as a practical politics, etc. But other feminists are much more sympathetic. They recognize that intersectional approaches are very ambitious. They are trying to speak to complex social phenomena, and that they may not get it right. You may not be able to explain racism and patriarchy and so on just through an intersectional approach, but we should always reach for that and to attempt to theorize these things. But such approaches, particularly from Marxist feminists, talk about a gendered and racialized approach to historical materialism, and particularly to class. And then, of course, there's a third approach today, post-Eurocentric Marxism. And the post-Eurocentric Marxism has been around for a while. And it's been around in the context of the 20th century struggles against colonialism, against apartheid. Somebody like Samir Amin, the late Samir Amin, who passed on last year, was very much at the forefront of a post-Eurocentric Marxism in trying to understand how, if you like, Eurocentric Europe wasn't the beginning and the end of history. And he gives us a much more complex understanding of the making of our modern world in his historical materialist analysis. You also have other post-Eurocentric Marxisms that have, if you like, found their place in post-colonial studies, although as insurgent voices. And then, of course, today in struggles, and I'm going to end with this point, in struggles today, Marxism is finding its voice and place and analysis in various struggles. It's finding its voice in against racializing neoliberalism and the new right wing, particularly the new fascism on the march of the planet. It's finding its voice in the context of indigenous resistance struggles. And there's a great chapter in the volume by Dunbar Ortiz, Roxanne, who's one of the leading indigenous activists in the United States. She's written an amazing book called Indigenous People's History of the United States. And Roxanne has been a post-Eurocentric Marxist, but an indigenous activist. And somebody called Glenn Coulthard from Canada, who's also a leading indigenous activist and theorist, he calls for a dialogue between Marxism and indigenous thought, and Frantz Fanon's work as well. Marxism is finding its place against a racist America and within Black Lives Matter struggles. There's amazing contributions here about trying to understand white supremacy in US society. There's great work being done around incarceration of the black problem in the United States by people in various movements. There's great work being done in Black Lives Matter itself to connect these struggles to a wider struggle for liberation and solidarity within the working class. There's work being done against Islamophobia and solidarity with Palestine, and various fronts of engagement on this question led by Marxists. And of course, the whole challenge of decolonizing the university, and this particular volume being a contribution, and the series being a contribution as a post-Eurocentric Marxism and contributing to the knowledge project in the university. So I'm going to stop there. Any comments, questions? We have some time, and then we're going to move on to everybody else.
What I'm trying to do in the chapter is actually different things internally. One of them is to discuss models of analysis, analytical models, such as colonialism and apartheid, in general terms, and in their application to my specific case, which is Israel-Palestine. The other thing I'm trying to do is to use some general theoretical understanding in order to reflect more deeply about the case of Israel-Palestine. So to have the models and to have the sort of empirical investigation. Now, the problem is that there is some kind of tension between the two, because in order to understand the notion of, to have meaningful discussion of Israel-Palestine, we need to have quite a deep historical knowledge that in most cases is not present, well, not in South Africa anyway. So part of the presentation will be about setting the case and highlighting some important dates and processes that are crucial to understanding the development of that society and where we are today. Let me start by making three general theoretical comments that relate to some extent to what Vish has said, and then go into my specific case study. The first general comment is that we tend to use terms such as racism and colonialism as mutually, as interchangeable. or to lump them together. And I think, at least for analytical purposes, we need to treat them as separate issues. I reserve the term race and racism to the outcome of the great global encounter around the discovery or the settlement of the New World with the use of racial slavery as a main mechanism. This links the New World, the Americas, North and South America, to Africa. And that relationship is central in the rise of race as a concept and racism as a social system. Of course, in more recent times, there is a spread of this relationship to other parts of the world, including Europe. Colonialism is a separate process. It's related, of course, and the rise of racism has to do with the rise of colonialism as well. But race has not been central to colonialism in the same way that it has been in the relationship between Africa and the Americas. So I would not use racism as a central concept. For example, to understand the English rule in India. Colonialism is central there. I would not use racism to discuss Islamophobia, because colonialism and the legacy of post-colonial societies and the conflict that arose in the post-colonial period are central to our understanding of Islamophobia and immigration, of course, but not racism in the original sense linked to racial slavery. That's a separate set of concepts. So that's one sort of general framing comment, and my concern here is much more with colonialism than with racism. Second point, which is related to that, is also distinguishing between the body of Marxist theory, making sort of a similar distinction. And I find that Marxist theory, it's much more useful for discussing racism, but less useful for discussing colonialism. And when we discuss colonialism, one development of Marxism related to Lenin and to the Communist International is much more central to the historical discussion of colonialism and also to the theoretical understanding. And I would say it's not meant as a joke, but I think the Soviet, even Stalinist, but I would say Soviet in more general terms, discussion of colonialism, specifically in the South African context and in the Palestinian context, is central to theoretical developments in the analysis, understanding, and political activism in both societies. It's not so much the Marxist analysis, it's specifically the early Soviet analysis, I should say, of the 1920s and early 1930s. And we still debate. We can dismiss Stalinism, and of course politically, it's an anti-democratic system and all that. But the Communist International, before the rise of Stalinism, and even it continued sort of independently, has been central by raising concepts such as the relationship between natives and settlers, the role of race and class, the relationship between peasants and workers, in the South African context and in the Palestinian context. And many of the theories, the programs of actions they proposed may be flawed, but the theoretical concept, the questions that they raise, are still central to our understanding of the nature of colonialism and the nature of resistance and, to colonialism, and in the colonial period and in the post-colonial period. So I would take seriously this kind of conceptualization, not as a model for how to build society, but as raising a set of questions that are of interest. For example, land and labor, that were raised historically by the Communist International. And it's interesting, for me particularly because of my case study, that one of the central documents that the Communist International produced in 1920, that was during the second Congress of the Communist International, is called Thesis on the National and Colonial Question, that were drafted by Lenin, and then they went through a process of editorial change, and then became sort of the standard policy for the involvement not just of the Soviet Union and its allied parties, but of national liberation movement throughout the century since then. And one of the interesting things for me particularly is that I think it's the only case that is discussed specifically in this thesis. Most of it is just general sort of reflections or points about colonialism and the struggle against it. The question of Palestine is the single case that is mentioned explicitly in this thesis. The rest is just general points about British colonialism and so on. And the reason it's there, and that's an interesting story, is because of its links, not because Palestine was an important issue in itself, definitely not important in the history of colonialism compared to countries like Egypt or Iraq or Iran and other cases in the Middle East, but because it was linked to the Jewish question. And the Jewish question was central to the development of the Marxist and more so the socialist movement in Eastern Europe, which of course was the historical and geographical site for the Communist International. So how to relate specifically to the Jewish working class? The Jewish working class, or Jews in general, were a minority in Eastern Europe, of course, a small minority, but they were a very big proportion of the working class. And as a result, the question of Zionism emerged as one of the key questions for the reconstitution of the communist movement after the Russian Revolution, and debates about it from the late 19th century until through the 1920s have been quite important in that respect. And the question of Palestine emerged in that context, not in the colonial context of what's happening in Palestine itself, but what was the impact of Zionism on the organization of Jewish workers in Eastern Europe and their relationship to the Communist Party there. So that's one angle that is of interest to me, but it's also important to realize in historical context how this question emerged and how it changed over time. The last general point that I want to raise has to do with the question of models. I'm not going to discuss it in any details here. I'm doing some of it in the chapter, but there is a general discussion of the suitability of theoretical models, not just concepts like race, class, power, and so on, that can all be central, but how they are related to each other in specific historical circumstances. So we know the concept of colonialism of a special type that has been central to the history of radical thought in South Africa. There are conceptualization of apartheid and attempts to treat apartheid as a theoretical model. And most recently, there is the notion of settler colonialism. Now, I want to say two things about settler colonialism. First, that the concept has been used in South Africa, but only marginally and only very recently. And it does seem to be sort of the cutting-edge theoretical debate, primarily in US theoretical discussion of colonialism. This is a good point and it's a bad point. It's a bad point because it has negative implications, because it becomes like a benchmark. If you don't use the term, you are not really on the topic. And that's something that I found, I encountered it, it's just an anecdote, but I encountered it many times, just recently, about 3 weeks ago. I attended a conference called Teaching Palestine. And it took place here. It's a joint project of South African organizations, Palestinian organizations, and American, US, Californian academic organizations. And they take, it's I think the second or third time they do this conference, and they visit, it's combined with kind of a study tour. And I presented the paper. The paper was not about contemporary development, it was a comparison of South African and Israeli so-called revisionist histories of radical attempts to challenge mainstream narratives. And I talked about models including settler colonialism in passing as a response to questions. After the presentation, a guy that I know from correspondence and I met him before the conference comes to me and says, "Full marks for courage." And I asked him, what do you mean? What's courageous about talking about, history and historiography? He said, because it sounded like you are questioning whether settler colonialism is a useful concept. Now, I was questioning that. Why do you need to be courageous to raise some kind of theoretical question? I find it very bizarre, but that's my experience. So that's sort of, I'm telling this story just to explain why I feel strongly about this concept, because I do criticize it, and I feel that politically it's becoming very problematic because it blocks the possibilities of free theoretical debate, because you have to adhere to some notion. Maybe in South Africa in the 1980s, there were similar concepts like racial capitalism, CST, colonialism of special type. You had to swear some kind of symbolic allegiance to them before you were allowed to speak. But in South Africa, in that context of the 1970s and 80s, this kind of adherence to a theoretical model were also code words for your political orientation. I find settler colonialism completely hollow from a political perspective. It just basically saying, I'm a real trendy kind of guy, and I know how to use all the trendy buzzwords, and I don't want to go on too much about it, but it's like using the word decolonial as opposed to decolonize. And it has some kind of trendy type meaning that I'm not going to go into. Anyway, what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism as a historical phenomenon is simply the presence of large number of settlers within the terms of the colonial project. It happened in South Africa, it happened in Palestine, and many other parts of the world. What is settler colonialism as a theoretical model? My answer is that it's not a theoretical model, because it covers many different cases that have very little to do with one another, except for the presence of settlers and natives in the same political framework. Settler colonialism is applicable to cases in which indigenous people have been wiped out or left with very small proportion of the population, like the US, Canada, Australia, but also to cases in which they've always been the vast majority of the population. If you can use the same concept in both types of society, it cannot possibly mean anything specific in terms of the dynamics of the society, the relationship between different groups, the relationship to the mother country, the colonial mother country, the trajectories of indigenous settler relations, the destinies of settlers in the post-colonial period. Settler colonial societies exhibit all the possible variation, and therefore, if the term covers so many cases, it doesn't have any kind of specific meaning. What do we do by way of using models in order to understand specific society? My strategy is to use basically a three-step approach. Study societies in their full historical specificities without imposing artificial boundaries between classes of cases like settler or non-settler colonialism, using general analytical concepts like race, class, power, and so on, rather than developing models that apply to one or maybe two cases, and engaging in selected comparisons in order to highlight both the general and unique feature of each case by examining them against one another. That's what I'm trying to do in this chapter and in my work in general, focusing on the two cases that I have particular familiarity and interest in, which is South Africa and Israel and Palestine. Okay, what do we need to know about Israel and Palestine in order to understand the case as it exists today in a historical context? Let me highlight four successive stages in the evolution of that society that would explain the situation as it exists today. First, 1917. 1917 is the period in which Palestine was constituted as a specific territory with its own government, boundaries, political regime, distinct from all the different countries in the region. Until 1917, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire and didn't have a distinct political identity. In 1917, it was after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the takeover of its territories by Britain and France and dividing the territories between them, Palestine became, first of all, a distinct political entity, and secondly, an entity, political entity, that is separated from the rest of the Middle East through a declaration by the British authorities known as the Balfour Declaration, which established Palestine, or designated Palestine, as the site for the formation, for the establishment of a Jewish national home. All Middle Eastern countries, and most of them, were placed under a political system known as the mandate system, in which the colonial powers, Britain and France, were supposed to prepare those countries for full independence. But Palestine had this distinction that it was part of the mandate system, but unlike all the other territories like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and so on, it was also the site for a Jewish national home. What is a Jewish national home? It wasn't specified in the declaration, but it was generally assumed to be support for massive settlement of Jews, primarily from Eastern Europe, in the territory, and eventual creation either of an autonomous political entity or a state that will have a Jewish character, Jewish in terms of its demographic nature, but also in terms of its political and ideological mission. So 1917 established Palestine. It also set the stage for a struggle over the future of the country between the indigenous population that organized their own national movement as a result, and the Jewish settlement movement known as Zionism, which also had the same aim of settling the country, becoming a majority, and establishing their own state in the region. It was a national type conflict, but it also had a colonial dimension. So it's important to keep both in mind. It wasn't just an ordinary national conflict over boundaries, over control of political power. It was part also of the general colonial expansion, because, first of all, Jews came there, most Jews, there were indigenous Jews as well, but most Jews came there as settlers under the sponsorship of the British Empire. And the British made this possible, at least for the 20 or 30 years after the initial designation of the territory as a site for settlement in the Balfour Declaration. Next stage, 1947, the UN decides to partition the territory, to divide it between a Jewish and Arab state, having realized that there is no prospect, or at least that was the prevailing thought at the time, no prospect of giving the country independence as a unified entity because of the internal struggle between these two movements, the Palestinian Arab nationalist movement and the Zionist movement. Because of the growing conflict between these two movements, the majority in the UN decided that it's not viable to give the country independence, because independence for the country as a whole would result in continuing these internal clashes and permanent civil war. So the solution, so it was seen at the time, was to partition the territory. That didn't work out for a number of reasons, but the main reason is that the territory allocated to the Jewish state, which became Israel eventually, included within it hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, to the point that if Israel had been established in those boundaries allocated to it by the UN, 45% at least of the population would be Palestinian Arab, and therefore it wouldn't really be a Jewish state. Jews would be maybe 55% of the population initially, but the prospect would be that the numbers would, the relative proportion would decline because of different birth rate and so on. So it was not viable from the perspective of the Zionist movement to get a state in which there were only a small majority, because that would mean, from their perspective, constant challenging of the notion of the Jewish state. You cannot establish a Jewish state if close to half of the population is not Jewish. And therefore, they embarked on a process, this is using a term that came into existence later on, but a process of ethnic cleansing that became known as the Nakba. Nakba literally means disaster or catastrophe. It's a term that was coined by Palestinians to refer to what happened in the course of the war of 1947-1948. And the Nakba involved the displacement of the majority of the Palestinian population who resided in the territories allocated to Israel at the time. So 80% of Palestinians in the territories that became Israel were displaced. They either fled or were expelled. And the people who fled because there was an impending danger of being involved in military conflict. And as a result, people left. But regardless of whether they left under duress or were expelled, the most crucial point is that when the war ended, they were prevented from coming back. Sometimes they just moved to their family 5 kilometers away, sometimes they crossed the international boundaries, sometimes they just moved to a different village or settlement within the same country. But as a result of the war and the establishment of new boundaries, they found themselves outside of their historical homeland, outside of their land in a physical sense, and outside of their homeland in a sort of more physical and symbolic sense as well. As a result of that, at least 50% of the Palestinians who exist today are refugees or the descendants of the refugees of 1948. This is a crucial point. There were other cases of population displacement or exchange during the same period. We know about India-Pakistan, of course. The partition of India and Pakistan resulted in population exchange, also as a result of violence and forcible migration of people, Hindus and Muslims to one side or the other. Germans were expelled from what became Czechoslovakia after the World War, from Poland. After the First World War, Greeks and Turks were also exchanging population. But nothing of this other example is comparable to the Nakba for 3 reasons. And these are important to recognize, both for the practical political implications and for the symbolic implications as well. First of all, the Nakba involved the displacement of indigenous people by settlers. In all the other cases, Germans, Turks, Greeks, Muslims in India and Hindus, they were all indigenous to the territory in different ways. So that's one component. Second component, the Nakba was asymmetrical. For every Jew displaced during the war, there were hundreds of Palestinians. Hindus and Muslims were displaced more or less in similar proportion, not exactly. But in both cases, there were millions of either side. But this was a sort of one-sided process. It impacted on the one side massively and hardly at all on the other side. And the third point is that, and that I think is crucial to understand the Palestinian issue as it evolved over the years, that the Nakba saw the displacement of 80% of the Arab population who resided in what became Israel, and they are about 60% of the total Palestinian population. In India, Pakistan, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Greek, Turkey, it was about 2-3% of the population who were affected. So the massive nature of this displacement is crucial to understand, because the majority of the indigenous population were displaced, but they remained identified or identifying themselves with their country, with their homeland, and the quest for return is central to their political movement. What were the implications of the Nakba? Because it set in motion the processes that we experience all the way to the present. First of all, by removing the bulk of the indigenous population, Jews became a majority and the dominant group in society. And this new demographic status quo became the norm, the benchmark for any kind of future solution. So the notion of Israel as a Jewish state dates to that event, Jewish democratic state. It's a mantra that people repeat all the time. And it goes back to the establishment of Jews as a majority as a result of the war of 1947-1948. Secondly, there were Palestinians who were left behind. There were about 15 to 20% of the population of all Israeli citizens, and a similar proportion of all Palestinians. So the population of, we refer to them as Palestinian citizens of Israel, are about 15 to 20% both of Israelis and of the Palestinian population. They are a minority in either community but it's important to focus on them because Palestinian citizens of Israel are the only section of the entire population who are fully bilingual, fully bicultural, fully integrated, both in Israeli and Palestinian society. So they are, in fact, the only group that transcends this kind of division to some extent between Jews and Palestinians, between Israeli and Palestinians. They were a truncated, defeated community, mostly based in the rural area. Most of the urban population was expelled or fled from the urban centers of Jerusalem, Haifa, Jaffa. But over the years, and again I must mention the Communist Party, which was central to that process, they reconstituted themselves as a community, established a group, political leaderships, intellectual life, and became a powerful group in the sense of formulating their own interests, defending their own identity, linking themselves to other Palestinians outside of Israel, but also playing a role in the Israeli political system. So the Nakba created this community as an important player on the field. The third point, very crucial, is that the Nakba created a large population of refugees from outside the borders of Israel. And the Palestinian national movement, perhaps uniquely in the modern history of anti-colonial struggle, has to operate with the bulk of its constituency outside of the territory that it seeks to liberate. If you look at South Africa, for example, we know there were people in exile, but there were activists, there were cadres, there were leadership, political leaderships in exile. The bulk of the South African population, black population, indigenous population, stayed in South Africa. Under apartheid, under oppression, but they stayed in South Africa. So 99% at least of the indigenous population were inside the country they wanted to liberate. In Palestine, that's not the case. And I don't know, I stand to be corrected, I don't know of any other national movement that has to operate, national liberation movement, from outside the boundaries of its own territory. So that's what makes the case so unique. Finally, and that's important both in relation to the Arab world and in relation to Israel, emptying the country of the bulk of its indigenous population created an empty space, both physically and in terms of the need for labor, for agriculture, for populating the areas around the borders, and replacing the Palestinian population that was displaced were Jews primarily from Middle Eastern and North African countries. We call them today, the term that is commonly used is Mizrahim, which literally means people of the East, of the Orient. And regardless of the historical sort of accuracy of this kind of term, that's the term we commonly use, Oriental Jews. And by translocating them from Arab countries, mostly Iraq and Yemen and North Africa, into border areas, into areas along the borders, to replace in the big cities, in neighborhoods depopulated from Palestinians, and in a string of what is known in Israel as development towns, new towns providing cheap labor for industry, primarily initially textile industry, but then other types of industries. This group of people replaced Palestinians, but they also became the bulk of the working class inside Israel. So they are Jews of Arab or Middle Eastern origins who became Israeli citizens with full political rights, but in a subordinate social and economic position. As a result, when Israel today, just jump into the present, when you talk about the working class, when you talk about the masses, when you talk about people who are disadvantaged, you talk primarily about this group of people. Not about Palestinians, which occupy a different place in the ethnic and social hierarchy. Okay, just to speed up a bit, the next important development 20 years later after the UN Partition Resolution is the 1967 war. As a result of the 1967 war, all of historical Palestine, that entity that was created in 1917, was unified under Israeli domination. But importantly, Israel adopted a different policy with regard to the population that was occupied in 67 compared to those who were incorporated into Israel in 1947. In 1947, Palestinians who remained within Israeli boundaries, as I said, about 15% of the population, were incorporated as citizens, subject to various formal and informal discriminatory mechanisms, but essentially as citizens. They have the right to vote, they have the right to form their own parties within limits because there was tight control by the security services. They could work, they could move around, not freely completely, but they were citizens, second-class citizens, but citizens nonetheless. And that's important. 1967, and part of the reason, the main part of the reason why that happened, and it was a process, it didn't happen immediately, was because the numbers were low. So the Israeli leadership at the time felt that incorporating gradually under some restrictions, 15% of non-Jews was viable, but not more than that. And the percentage remained more or less 15 to 20% all the way to the present, but that was viable, even though it created serious problems for them, but they could do it. In 1967, there was another population that was at the time about 2 or 3 times the size of the existing Palestinian citizen population of Israel. If they had been incorporated into Israel under the same conditions, the same problem that led to the Nakba in 1948 would have re-emerged, because it would have meant about, at the time, over a million people, in a population of 3 million altogether, and over the years, 4 or 5 million people live now in Palestine, in those territories occupied in 1967. It would have made, in the same way that the original partition resolution of 47, it would have made Israel very difficult to sustain the notion of a Jewish state if 40% of the population were non-Jews. By the present, the population under occupation, together with Palestinian citizens of Israel, are at least 50% of the total population. So incorporating them on the basis of equality would mean no prospect of Israel maintaining its Jewish identity. If they have full civil rights, if they can participate in elections, if they can move freely around. That was not viable from their perspective, and as a result, these people have been subjected for the last 52 years, from 1967 to the present, to a system of military government where they cannot become citizens, they don't have basic access to civil, human, political rights, they cannot gain their independence, but they cannot be incorporated either. So in a sense, they are in an intermediate position in a limbo. They can't form their own state, they can't be integrated into Israel as another state. They are stuck permanently in a situation in which the best they can gain from an Israeli perspective is some kind of municipal autonomy. And nominally they have municipal autonomy, but nothing beyond that. So they have no say in the selection and of government determination of policies that affect their own lives. They are subject to severe restrictions of military nature, serious restrictions on their movements, employment, trade, education, and so on, and there's no end in sight. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that there has been in process something known as the peace process, supposed to determine the final status of these territories, but this peace process has been undergoing for decades with nothing changing in the actual living conditions and political conditions of the population. And in the last 5 years at least, even the pretense that there is any process going on has been abandoned. And there's basically zero chance it will be renewed and anything will come out of it. What do we make of all that? I just want to not to take too much time about that. What do we make of all that? How do we analyze this situation? The concept of apartheid has been used in order to describe it because permanent marginalization and permanent disenfranchisement of a large part of the population is obviously one of the features of apartheid. Now it's important when we talk about the Israeli regime or the Israeli system being a kind of apartheid, we don't talk specifically about Israel being like apartheid in South Africa necessarily, because apartheid is obviously historically a South African institution, but it's also a concept in international law. And that concept becomes more relevant today because it captures the power relations and conflict over resources between different groups that inhabit the same space and state structure. Now, the definition of apartheid in international law is an institutionalized regime of systematic repression and domination of one group over another. And I think that applies to Israel. There is an interesting book that came out a few months ago by John Dugard called Confronting Apartheid, in which he talks about his experience as human rights lawyer and a scholar in South Africa, but also he spent about a decade being the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied territories, 1967 occupied territories, and he discusses all the aspects of the Israeli regime which conform to the notion of apartheid. I think it's interesting to read if you want to pursue this question. But there are two dimensions, so I'm not going to sort of justify that. I think it's kind of self-evident, but there are two dimensions in which the Israeli system is different from apartheid. It's important to understand them, both for purposes of analyzing the regime and also for the prospect of resistance and change. First of all, the Israeli system is based on the exclusion of indigenous people as the main provider of labor, while South African apartheid was based on the exploitation of black labor power as the mainstay of white-dominated economy in society. This difference has implications not only for our understanding of the regime, but also for resistance. The key role played by the internal mass movement led by black trade unions in South Africa, which resulted in the demise of apartheid, cannot be replicated in Israel-Palestine. Palestinian workers are simply not central to the social and economic system in Israel. They don't have this leverage that black workers or the black masses in general have in South Africa. They can go on general strike tomorrow. It will have a minimal impact on the Israeli economy because they constitute about 4 or 5% of the total workforce, and in marginal industries like agricultural labor, construction. But none of the core industrial and definitely none of the core security-related industry, which are the bulk, the central core of the economy, will be affected in the least by this kind of strike. So the same kind of strategy used in South Africa, disrupting the system from within, is not viable for Palestinians. The second, it doesn't mean there's no strategy of resistance, it just cannot be the same. The second aspect in which the Israeli system is different from the pattern in South Africa is the unique position of that population I referred to earlier, the Mizrahim, a Jewish settler group which is indigenous to the broader region, not to Palestine itself, but to the broader Middle Eastern region, which shares cultural background with Palestinians, but has no common political consciousness with them. And that kind of group is without equivalence in South Africa. Mizrahim have gone through decades of cultural and political assimilation into Israeli society, and expectations that they could have retained some kind of Arab identity, that there are some form of Arab Jews, as some people hopefully refer to them, are delusional. But at the same time, and that's crucial to understand, no political change can happen without them. They are the bulk of the Jewish population. They are marginalized elements, socially and economically, not politically, but socially and economically, within that society. So you cannot have internal political change without mobilizing at least some elements of that population. But historically, and I write it in the paper, I will go through this now, they have been aligned with right-wing nationalist politics. So how to break this alliance with the right wing is the crucial political challenge in Israel today, a challenge that I don't have any magic solution for. I call this system apartheid of a special type, because legally and politically it has some of the core elements of the apartheid system as practiced in South Africa and as referred to in international law, but socially, sociologically, if you will, it has some crucial differences. So it is apartheid, but it's not exactly the same as apartheid in South Africa. I go in the paper again, I won't go through all this, all the sort of similarities and differences, but I want to end with the question of what can be done about all this. And as I said earlier, mobilization that relies on the working class is not viable. Palestinians are not the bulk of the working class, first of all, and Jews who are the bulk of the working class politically have nothing to do with Palestinians. In fact, they are the group politically and ideologically most remote from Palestinians and most hostile to their quest for independence. And that's kind of one of the paradoxes of Israeli society, that the group that culturally and historically has the most in common with Palestinians, Jews from other Arab countries, politically are also the most hostile in terms of their support for right-wing nationalist and religious policies. How to break this state of affairs, how to change it, is a big challenge, as I said. There's no solution to it. What can be done? Is a number of other elements I just mentioned in passing. First of all, indigenous people, Palestinians, are fragmented, partly as a result of conscious policies by Israel to fragment them physically and politically, partly as a result of their own internal squabbles, which I guess is a universal feature of all national movements. They are fragmented legally and politically into at least 3 or 4 different segments. There are the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. There are the Palestinians in the occupied territories. There are distinctions also between those in the West Bank and Gaza, but I won't go into that, and in East Jerusalem, but let's treat them as one unified population. And there are the refugees who live outside of the boundaries of historical Palestine, in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan in particular. So they are fragmented physically, and each fragment is in a different legal situation, different political circumstances, adhering and operating under different political circumstances. The task, the way I see it, but again, I don't have a formula on how to achieve it, is first of all to start overcoming this fragmentation by developing common agendas. Common agendas without even physical political movement to support them means conceptualizing the situation as a unified challenge in the anti-colonial struggle, but of course recognizing the different conditions that each segment of the population lives under. You cannot ignore them because they have legal political rights, different legal rights, different physical spaces, and so on. But the conceptualization of the struggle can be unified, and there are some moves in that direction. Secondly, there is a lot of political factionalism and division within each segment. Just yesterday, so the day before yesterday, on Tuesday, there was general elections in Israel, and one of the sort of problematic aspects of this election is that a unified electoral front of all Palestinian citizens that was established in 2015, at the time of the last election, broke up before these elections, and Palestinians competed in different political lists, 2 of them, which kind of is not terrible fragmentation, but it's more than should have been. And as a result, they lost some of their seats in parliament because of completely uncalled for factional conflict. Of more serious nature is the factional conflict in the occupied territories between the sort of more secular nationalist movement of Fatah that controls the Palestinian Authority and the more Islamic nationalist movement of Hamas that is the dominant force in Gaza. This presents a very serious challenge for liberation politics. It's not something that can be resolved from the outside. It's something Palestinians need to sort out themselves. The last element that I mentioned is solidarity movement. That's the one thing we hear a lot about. And there's been a lot of attempts to use the South African example of boycotts and sanctions and divestments in order to create a similar or equivalent Palestinian movement to support the Palestinian struggle. The one thing I want to say, well, two things I want to say about it, and I'll finish again. First of all, solidarity is essential. Pressure from the outside on the Israeli regime is essential. But it's important not to delude ourselves that this movement can be equivalent to South Africa, because the international anti-apartheid movement in the South African context was followed and was in a sense a sideshow to the actual mass struggle in South Africa itself. There is no equivalent struggle today in Palestine itself. So the solidarity movement, even though it's important and necessary, operates without a local movement, which of course is not viable. You can get so far through expression of solidarity. You cannot transform relationship of domination when you are based at US universities. I mean, it's completely delusional to think that that movement on its own can lead to any kind of positive change within the country. It's not that there's anything wrong in the movement itself, it's just that without the rise of a mass movement within the country, it won't be able to reach any kind of positive results. So that are just things to keep in mind when we evaluate the situation. I think.
Thank you, man.
It's just a breakdown of the different themes and concepts that I am going to look at. Before I begin, let me say that I'm aware that in places some of the concepts I introduce might sound arcane, but hopefully in the context of the paper they are intelligible. Secondly, I hope Rand doesn't object, but there are going to be times when I'm going to run race and colonialism together. I don't think it's got implications for the argument. My motive in writing this paper was a dissatisfaction with the way in which the democratic breakthrough of 1994 seemed to have been understood. Obviously something important happened in 1994, but its effects on the social topography of South Africa wasn't being explored. Questions such as, if colonialism wasn't destroyed, how does it continue to exist and structure social practice under conditions of liberal democracy, needed to be seriously tackled. In particular, what seemed to me to be lacking was an appreciation of liberal democracy not just as an extension of the franchise and the attribution of human rights, but as a determinate discursive and disciplinary regime with its own mode of subject formation, and the effect of the introduction of such a regime on both capitalism and colonialism. So my question is, if colonial racism is more than a vanishing residue of the past, an effect of inertia, what is it? And what drives its reproduction in the present? In order to contextualize the paper in this presentation, I've begun by briefly looking at the limitations of the Marxist concept of the social totality and how this imposes damaging constrictions on the analysis of the colonial racial antagonism. I've also tracked Walpy's treatment of race and class from 1972 to his book Race, Class and the Apartheid State in 1988 in an effort to bring to light some of the problems in the Marxist theorization of the status of the colonial racial antagonism, even before what is sometimes called the democratic breakthrough of 1994. Okay, so now we're on section 2. From the social totality to the big other. Difference, heterogeneity, and the articulation of race and class in South Africa today. South African Marxism has always struggled to grasp race and class as both heterogeneous, that is, as distinct relations and practices, and at the same time as united. It has not been helped in this by the basic Marxist problematic itself, which conceives society, the social, as always structured in the final instance and more or less directly by class. Even after the Althusserian revolution of the early 1960s, Marxism has continued to totalize the social structure. For all the Althusserian references to relative autonomy and the specific effectivity of the instances comprising the social, for all the references to the relations of dislocation, torsion, and non-correspondence, the concept of the social totality, the so-called structure of structures, was still maintained as the conceptual frame through which to think the social. Althusser never really accomplished his break with essentialism. At the end of the day, the centripetal pull of structural homogeneity trumps heterogeneity, and class saturates the social field. It is only when, in my view, in the mid-1980s, that Leclerc and Mouffe bring into Marxist theory the Lacanian big other, in terms of which the socio-symbolic, including the economy, is constitutively inconsistent, constitutively incomplete and barred. That is, doesn't exist as a self-sufficient totality. That it became possible to rethink the social structure as comprising a multiplicity of uneven and antagonistic practices, not enclosed a priori within a totality closed in on itself. The Lacanian thesis taken over by Leclerc and Mouffe is then that the big other does not exist, or if you like, that there is no other of the big other, no Althusserian structure of structures, subordinating and grounding the social. Once it is acknowledged that the social lacks a foundation and is not a tightly sutured and self-sufficient whole or totality, the heterogeneity of social relations and practices such as class and race can at last be acknowledged, and they're being held together, understood as the precarious product of political struggles for hegemony, and not as intrinsic to the social per se. The implications of this radical decentering of the social for South African Marxism cannot be overemphasized. Take the case of Harold Walpy. In the early 1970s, Walpy criticized the orthodox colonialism of a special type model for being insensitive to the specific ways in which South African capitalism depended on racial domination. He then outlined how during the early period South African capitalism depended on its articulation via migrant labor with indigenous pre-capitalist modes of production, and how this articulation itself depended on an apparatus of racial domination. He denied this analysis was class reductionist because it emphasized that racial domination exercised its own specific effectivity, and was in fact a necessary condition for the reproduction of South African capitalism itself. In fact, however, practices of colonial racial domination were never considered sui generis of their own type, but always conceived from the point of view of their effect vis-à-vis the accumulation of capital. The colonial racial antagonism was never seen as possessing its own ontological and political valence, and was never acknowledged in terms independent of class. White desire was always, at the end of the day, class desire. Of course, insisting on the specific difference of colonial racial domination does not mean that the South African capitalist class did not maintain the system of cheap black labor and the system of coercion necessary in order to do that. But what it does mean is that even when doing so, its investment in whiteness was never entirely collapsed into its investment in capitalism. Section 3, Walpy's regression from class to the constitutive subject. The problems with Walpy's treatment of class and race only start to become crystal clear, however, in his 1988 text, Race, Class and the Apartheid State. Changes in the structure of South African capitalism, in particular the emergence of a new regime of accumulation involving the production of what Marxists call relative surplus value, lead him to conclude that, quote, for large-scale capital in all sectors, the maintenance of capitalism has become detachable from the maintenance of white domination, end of quote. Here is where things get interesting. Instead of concluding that class can no longer account for race, he makes a last-ditch effort to demonstrate that even under the conditions referred to above, race is still subordinate to class. That is not a mere residue of the dependence of the previous regime of accumulation on white domination, and therefore, to the extent that it persists, does not need to be acknowledged as sui generis and self-reproducing. He wants at all costs to avoid the conclusion that it is an inertial and residual effect that will either wither away or alternatively has to be understood as much more radically distinct from class than Marxism would appear ready to grant. He wants to avoid arguing that it's just a residue, because then of course that would put him in exactly the same position as the liberals who have always argued that. He wants to avoid arguing that it's something that has to be analyzed in its own terms, because that too would take him too far away from Marxism, or at least the Marxism to which he ascribes. His response is to claim that because members of the black working class still experience themselves in racial terms, race is integral to what he terms the concrete, as distinct from the abstract concept of class. Race still falls under the concept of class, this time as lived experience, and so it is neither a vanishing residue nor a social relation able to sustain and reproduce itself independently of class. Politically, this is very important for Walpy, because it seems to imply that anti-racist practice is also anti-capitalist. The sleight of hand here, and the point where the entire argument collapses, is the claim that race falls under the concept of class, is part of class, because the lived experience of class members is racial. Just because the same concrete individual is the point of intersection of two social relations, class and race, does not obliterate the difference between them. does not obliterate the difference between the two and sanction the inclusion of one, in this case race, under the concept of the other, in this case class. This operation of homogenization is only possible on condition that one conceives the concrete individual, who is the point of intersection of these practices, as itself a constitutive subject, such that both practices, class and racial, become mere phenomenal expressions of an underlying identity. In other words, the individual ceases to be the site of the articulation of these practices and becomes the source or origin of their articulation, and thus of the social structure itself. This, it goes without saying, is the idealist and not the materialist position. It is also the liberal and not the Marxist one. What is the upshot? The status of racism is that of a vanishing residue whose structural underpinnings have disappeared and whose place in the social topography, especially post-94, is thus very unclear indeed. In what follows, my point of departure is that we should cease trying always to explain race in the terms of class and recognize the colonial antagonism as sui generis and self-reproducing. As long as whites are able to play what Fanon calls white being and plenitude, off against black destitution and lack, the colonial antagonism will retain its Fanonian charge and reproduce itself. At the same time, in order to grasp the role of race today in post-94 South Africa, I also analyze it in relation to capital accumulation and liberal democracy. My objective is to show how racial inequality can be produced and reproduced while appearing not to be. In other words, be reproduced via the free exchange of commodities between equal individuals. And my starting point is thus how class relations of inequality and exploitation are themselves reproduced for Marx in this way under capitalism. Section 4, Capitalism and the Unconscious. According to the French psychoanalyst Lacan, Marx invented the symptom, by which he means that before Freud, Marx, at least implicitly, introduced the distinction between the unconscious and consciousness, and showed how the former, the unconscious, both sustains and disrupts the latter. From this perspective, class and class antagonism are not positive categories available for straightforward sociological analysis, but comprise the repressed unconscious of capitalism. Class cannot be isolated as an object of observation and description, because it is concealed beneath the relations of commodity exchange, in the terms of which class antagonism and exploitation do not exist. Only free individuals exchanging commodity equivalents. In this sense, the entire consistency of class lies in the distortion of appearances that accompany the production of a given order. As Marx himself emphasizes in chapter 32, volume 1 of Capital, the chains of capitalism are invisible. The chains of capitalism are invisible, as capitalism does not involve perceptible coercion. The relations of class production are, as relations, necessarily absent, and all that is spontaneously transparent to consciousness is the fetishism of man and of the commodity. The fetishism of man, the belief that individuals are autonomous and free. But Marx unearths the special character of labor power as a commodity, the existence of exploitation, and how the class structure on which this is based reproduces itself. In this way, he is able to account for the structural inequality and cracks in the bourgeois order of individual freedom and equality as symptoms of the capitalist unconscious. Freud's transcendental turn, via which he seeks to uncover the conditions of possibility of the gaps in the phenomena of consciousness. By transcendental turn, this is obviously taken from Kant, the idea that the question we ask is of any given phenomenon or experience, what are the conditions of possibility of that experience or phenomenon? So Freud's transcendental turn, in which he seeks to uncover the conditions of possibility of the gaps in consciousness, is thus, according to Lacan, anticipated by Marx, who performs the same operation, starting, however, not with late 19th century hysteria, but with the historical symptom, the worker insurrections of 1830 to 1850. What is important here is that this Janus-faced structure of capitalism, that is, it operates by the very relations of exchange that occultate its inner structural mechanisms, makes it possible for capitalism to produce inequality, divide and distribute subjects and resources along class lines without ever appearing to do so. Marx is insistent that the opacity of capitalism is constitutive. Its illusory appearance is not illusory in the sense of being a subjective error that could be done away with, but is objective and integral to capitalism. That is why the expression false consciousness is a tautology. All consciousness, from which the relations of production are necessarily absent, is false. The relevance of analyzing capitalism in this way, by bringing out the split between how it objectively appears to function and its inner structural mechanisms to the problem facing us, is that this is precisely how colonialism functions in South Africa today. That is, it distributes resources not directly, but through the capitalist exchange process that involves free and equal individuals. It objectively appears to treat individuals as free and equal economic subjects and citizens, while dividing them and distributing resources along racial lines. In other words, the crack in South Africa's non-racial democracy, namely the persistence of racial inequality, has to be tracked down in the combination of the capitalist and colonial unconscious. In his analysis of anti-Semitism, the Slovenian philosopher Zizek performs the same operation. What he seeks to identify are the conditions of possibility of anti-Semitism. What must be the case when, although he strenuously disavows it, the anti-Semite discriminates against Jews? His answer is the anti-Semitic unconscious. At the level of his consciousness, at the level of his conscious experience, at the level of the way in which he describes himself, the anti-Semite is not anti-Semitic. In his practice, he is. Therefore, he does not know how Jews really appear to him, only how they seem to appear to him. Like the capitalist, it is in his practice that he bears witness to how things effectively appear to him, as opposed to how they immediately appear to him. Liberal democracy, section 5. Capitalist fetishization, which, as we have seen, is rooted in the exchange process, itself intrinsic to capitalism, never operates alone, but is always combined with the juridico-political instances. In particular, their specific ways of constituting subjects. When these instances are those of liberal democracy, individuals are interpolated as free and equal citizens. This construction of subjectivity complements that of the capitalist exchange relation, reinforcing the fetishization of the individual as autonomous and equal to all other individuals. What needs to be stressed here is that liberal democracy is itself a specific regime of subject constitution and not just a matter of universal suffrage. This is important for understanding the consequences of the 1994 democratic breakthrough. In particular, its effects, the effects of the 1994 democratic breakthrough vis-à-vis both colonialism and capitalism. 6. Colonialism and the unconscious. Colonialism is not capitalism, and its structure is different. The colonial unconscious refers to the processes of signification and subject distribution that constitute the colonial racial antagonism. These processes are not transparent to consciousness, and colonial racial identities, black and white, are therefore experienced as natural and innate. However, the colonial antagonism, unlike the capitalist antagonism, is out in the open from the start. What happens with the advent of liberal democracy in a colonial context is that colonial forms of consciousness, and not just the colonial unconscious, are repressed. Thus, capitalism and colonialism stand in very different relations to liberal democracy. While liberal democracy reinforces the autonomy and equality of Homo economicus, the fetishism of man, reinforces capitalist fetishization, it represses the racialized modes of identification of colonialism. So on the one hand, liberal democracy reinforces the idea that individuals, as they seem in the capitalist exchange process, are free and equal. It reinforces that. On the other hand, it represses the racialized modes of identification of colonialism. The 1994 democratic breakthrough did not merely extend the franchise, it transformed the subjective economy of whites and blacks. And here I only look at how it transforms the subjective structure of whites, but clearly it does the same for blacks, but I'm not looking at that in this paper. Whites, for example, were unconscious of the processes responsible for their constitution as whites before 1994. They experienced it as something innate and natural. They were unconscious of the social processes of signification and subject distribution that resulted in the colonial antagonism. Whites, for example, are unconscious of the processes responsible for their constitution as whites before 1994. But they were conscious of themselves as whites. They were unconscious of the processes making them white, but they were conscious of themselves as whites, as subjects enjoying full being, unlike blacks, condemned to what Fanon calls non-existence. After 1994, constructed now as non-racial citizens, their whiteness is not eliminated, but it is repressed. And this repression of colonial consciousness is structural, in that the self-consciousness of a subject cannot be simultaneously colonial and democratic. To the extent it is one, the other just is repressed. Last section. He only knows how blacks seem to appear to him, not how they really appear to him. How does the colonial unconscious puncture democratic life and return as a disturbance, a symptom in South Africa today? One of the most important ways in which this occurs is via the Janus-faced structure of capitalism. The capitalist, in his exchange relation with workers, treats them as free and equal individuals with whom he exchanges a wage for labor power. The capitalist, in his exchange relations with workers, treats them as free and equal individuals. However, this conceals the class relations to the means of production that drive the very exchange of labor power for a wage. The asymmetrical relations of class power give the capitalist control over investment, management, and employment. Once the place of capital is occupied by subjects unconsciously enthralled to colonial whiteness, once the capitalist unconscious is crossed with the colonial unconscious, the class distribution of resources and subjects receives a colonial racist inflection. The capitalist in South Africa can thus objectively appear to treat individuals as free and equal, and at the same time, because he is enthralled to the colonial unconscious, be the vector of a specifically colonial racist distribution of assets and opportunities. Unless he occupied the place of capital, this would not be possible. But if he didn't identify with whiteness, the reproduction of racial inequality would not take place. His systematic privileging of whites across all areas of his practice, investment, procurement, management, and employment, attests to the fact that, no matter how much he disavows it, his practice bears witness to how blacks effectively appear to him, as opposed to how they immediately appear to him. He claims not to see color, but to be governed exclusively by the non-racial law of accumulation. Embedded in his practice is evidence to the contrary. He might invoke the legacy of the past, the so-called white skill nexus, as justifying his conduct in terms of pure economic rationality. But the historic advantage of whites is not a neutral given fact. It's always symbolically framed, and it is only if he is subject to the unconscious colonial fantasy of white being and black lack that he will allow himself to be governed by white historical advantage. Apartheid may have been displaced by liberal democracy, but it lives on in the white unconscious. The inertia theory, which holds that racism is just a residue of the past, does not hold water. Because without positing the colonial unconscious, it is impossible to account for objective capitalist practice in South Africa today. Colonialism can no longer be out in the open, but this doesn't prevent it from continuing to structure economic and social practice in South Africa today. 8. Back to Walpy. Race and class intersect in the analysis I have sketched, but not in the same way as in Walpy. Firstly, there is no sense in which South African capitalism depends for its very existence on colonial racial domination. Yes, Walpy in 1988, Race, Class and the Apartheid State, concurs with this, but as we have seen, at the same time, he attempts conceptually to bind race and class together. Race, in his book Race, Class and the Apartheid State, falls under the concrete concept of class, with the result that its fate is inextricably bound up with that of class. That is why, in 1988, Walpy still feels justified in arguing that the anti-colonial is anti-capitalist. In the analysis I have sketched, There is an intersection and articulation of race and class, but they remain distinct axes of domination, and there is no implicit recourse to the notion of a constitutive subject in order to unify them. Secondly, the colonial antagonism is theorized in its own right, in ontological, that is, Fanonian terms, as between white being and black non-being. And its reproduction hinges on the affective charge, or what is sometimes known as jouissance, on the affective charge, or jouissance, procured by the performance of whiteness, by playing white being off against black destitution. Of course, this relationship can never exist in an economic vacuum, but it is not causally dependent on capitalism. In other words, it is really heterogeneous vis-à-vis capitalism, and is not squeezed into the orbit of class by the fiction of the social totality or the constitutive subject.